Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. This is going to be the fourth and final video of the series where we take a look at building the NH35 Submariner based on the Artisans de Geneve rough mat. There's just one thing left to do before I get to put everything together. Off screen, I removed the loom pip from this bezel, and now I'm going to replace it with one that's loomed with BGW9. I've created a little puddle of super glue on that plastic bag, and here what I'm doing is using one of those micro Q-tips without the fluffy part on it to dab it into the hole in which the loom pip will sit. I removed the old loom pip for two reasons. First, I wanted all the loom on this watch to match, so the hour markers have BGW9, the hands have BGW9, albeit not a lot. And now this new loom pip has matching BGW9. And the second reason is it made it easier to paint that little triangle at the top of the bezel insert. I've gotten the loom pip out, and using a pair of tweezers I've placed it into this little recess at the top of the bezel insert. Now just making sure it's all flush. This operation has a similar risk to placing the hour markers on the dial, in which you don't want to use too much glue or it'll squeeze out, and too little won't hold it in place. And with one final push of the tweezers, the loom pip is set into place, and I can actually look to assembling the watch. And this build starts off no different than all the other builds, with placing the movement into the movement holder. Feels like forever ago when I screwed the movement down for the first time to put that decorated rotor and bridge on the back of the movement. And here, breaking out the fully assembled dial and placing it on top of the movement, getting it lined up nice and straight to see which dial feet need to be cut off. One thing I found and actually like on some newer dials that I've ordered is that they'll actually have an indication on the back of the dial as to which dial feet to cut off, depending on how you'd like the crown oriented. That said, I still usually just place them on top of the movement to double check before cutting anything off. With the dial feet now removed, it's time to shave down those two little nubs that are left over so we have a nice flush dial. And with the power of editing, I was able to do that in a matter of seconds. With the little nubs now removed and the dial nice and flush, there's only two things left to do. Leave the camera out of focus and then push the dial into place, making sure to get those two little dial feet into the two little holes that hold them. Here, just double checking that the dial is actually sitting nice and flush to the movement. I don't want one area of the dial elevated, as when the hands sweep around, they will make contact with one of the hour markers. With the dial now mounted to the movement, all that's left to do is give the crown a few turns to get the date to flick over at midnight, and then it's on to setting the hands. And of course, with this being an NH35 base build, I'm starting with the hour hand. For those tuning in now that may have missed the first video, the hands and hour markers of this build were hand painted with this orange enamel paint, as well as hand loomed with BGW9. If you're curious how I accomplished this, go ahead and tune into the first video of this series and you'll be able to see all the trials and tribulations I endured to get that done. Here I'm just using a pair of plastic tweezers to adjust the hour hand so that it lines up with the 12 o'clock marker, and then I'll break out the hand setting tool and push it into place. I want to make sure that this hand is perpendicular to the dial, so what I'll do is press it into place and then rotate the whole assembly 90 degrees to the left and then press it again just to make sure that everything is lined up. Giving the tool a bit of a wiggle, the hand is now set, and what I'll do is wind it all the way around the dial just to make sure that it's not going to come into contact with any of the hour markers. This is a relatively short hand, so I wasn't too concerned about contact issues. However, you never know, especially with that 12 o'clock marker. With the hour hand not having any issues, I'll line it back up at 12 o'clock and then break out the minute hand to set that in place. Frequent viewers of the channel will know that I often struggle with the minute hand, however it does appear that I was able to get this one set with just 2 attempts of the hand setting tool. This is a little surprising as more recently I've opted to use Rodico to hold the hand in place before pushing it down with the hand setting tool, and as you can see I'm using some plastic tweezers here. And for the second time, breaking out the hand setting tools, just giving the hand a nice firm but gentle push to set it in place. And once that's on, of course I need to check for clearance, so I'm just going to rotate both hands all the way around the dial just to make sure that they don't come in contact with each other or with any of the hour markers. And everything seems good. I will make one small note that I used black paint on the minute hand, and in some situations it is a little hard to see the black minute hand on the dark blue dial, just something to consider for the future. It also looks like the date is flicking over about 6 minutes before midnight. Not the most accurate I've ever been able to get, but still within reason. Looks like the minute hand was slightly out of alignment, so just breaking out the hand setting tool once more and making sure that it's parallel to the dial. And of course, with any adjustment made to the hand, I'll need to check for clearance once again. Looks like I took it easy on this check and only moved the hand from 12 o'clock to 3 o'clock. However, nothing felt like it was binding, so it's okay to move on to the next step. Last but not least, I need to set the seconds hand, using my new favorite technique of putting a little bit of Rodico in the tip of the hand setting tool, holding the seconds hand with that, and then just pushing it on to the post. And of course, I wasn't able to get it on the first attempt, so I have to take a second bite of the cherry on this watch. As you can see, the second hand is painted white and is adorned with an orange tip, and I actually really like this color combination of white on the dark blue dial. It stands out far better than the black of the minute hand. That said, this watch is a touch flashier than my usual style, and I have yet to wear it anywhere outside of these videos. The seconds hand has been attached and was taken away, and as with everything, it's time to check for clearance and make sure that even the seconds hand isn't touching anything. Which in this case, I was all good, and once I stopped moving the hands around, it's time to flip the movement over and work on setting the movement into the case. I'm sure one thing you, the viewer, has realized is that in these top-down shots, the dial is sometimes overblown by the camera light. I believe this is due to me using a ring light, and I have since upgraded to 2 panel lights to help diffuse the light across the entire movement. That's enough camera talk for this video. As you can see, I've flipped the movement over, and now I will press down on the lever that releases the crown stem. You'll see that the crown stem did not release. What I should have done is secure the movement into place before pressing down on the crown stem release lever, and then magically the stem will come out. With that stem now out, I can place the movement on my movement pad and work on setting it into the case. I have already cleaned, dusted, and blown off the inside and outside of the crystal of this case, so all that's left to do is gently place it over the movement and press it down. I'll then flip the entire assembly and the movement pad over to flip over the movement before placing it back onto the pad. Then using some tweezers, I'll align the crown tube with the slot in the movement where the stem inserts into. This can sometimes be tricky if the case has a tighter grip on the movement, making it hard to move in small increments. Luckily for this case, it had just the right amount of resistance, making it a breeze. Just flipping the assembly over here to see how everything looks once it's cased up, before flipping it back over to start the crown stem work. Giving the movement a little press here just to make sure that it's seated in place. And then going ahead and unscrewing the crown from the case and screwing the stem into the crown. Then placing that assembly through the case and into the movement. As you can see, the stem is much too long for this case, so in a second here I'll break out the calipers and work on cutting it down. A recent viewer commented that I was the first person he saw compress the crown when measuring the distance between the crown and the case of the watch. Though this is the way I've always done it, I'm sure there's many different ways to measure that distance and ensure that the cut is made accurately. There's also other factors like, are other people using watches that do not have screw-down crowns? This is the way I've always done it. It's usually worked out for me. I will admit I have cut a few crown stems too short, but that was more in my early days. So now at that measurement, I'm once again going to depress that little lever and pull the stem out of the watch. I'll then unscrew the stem from the crown, and then using that measurement, I'll get everything lined up on the threaded side of the stem and make a little mark as to where I should cut. And of course, I'm always going to use that mark as a reference, cutting just above it just to ensure that I get enough stem left. Then it's time to break out the power tools and remove any burrs that are left on the stem, as well as cone it off to make it easier to get the crown back onto it. This can sometimes be a time-consuming process, as failure to cut enough of the stem away leaves a gap between the crown and the edge of the case, meaning that you have to eject the stem, unscrew it from the crown, and then grind it down just a little bit more to see if that gets you to where you need to be. However, slow and steady really does win the race, as if you cut the stem too short, you won't be able to use all the functions of the movement and actually run the risk of the stem getting stuck inside of it. Once the stem is cut to the correct length, it's time to add a little bit of Loctite to it just to ensure that the crown does not unscrew from it when in operation. I use blue Loctite for this process, which offers medium adhesion. There is red Loctite, which is permanent, as well as purple Loctite, which is low strength. With the dab of Loctite now on the stem, it's time to screw on the crown for the final time before cleaning up any leftover adhesive that's still on the stem. To clean up any leftover Loctite, I usually just grip the stem with a paper towel and rotate it around a few times. If the Loctite is still wet, it usually comes right off. While that Loctite is drying, I can look at lubing all of the gaskets and O-rings of the watch case. Starting with the O-ring inside of the crown tube, I'm going to get a little bit of this silicone grease on this micro Q-tip and place it into the crown tube and whisk it around a few times. Looking to get an even coating on the interior O-ring before using that same micro Q-tip to coat the exterior O-ring. With those two items now properly lubricated, I can look at getting the caseback O-ring lubed up as well. To do that, it's a little bit different. I'm going to take the caseback gasket and place it into this container with a sponge-like membrane that's permeated with silicone grease. Then I'll close it up and give it a few twists to make sure that the silicone grease is evenly distributed on the O-ring. And after that, the gasket is ready to be put in the case. So using a pair of tweezers, I'll just drop it right into the groove it's meant to sit in. Or I'll at least drop it adjacent to the groove that it's supposed to sit in, and then using my fingers, I'll misalign it before getting it all set in place. It's very important that this O-ring is properly placed, as failure to do so can leave it vulnerable to pinching and risking the water resistance of the watch. Luckily for me, it doesn't look like there was any issues with getting that O-ring seated, and now I can look at putting the crown stem back through the case and into the movement. Then making sure to tighten it all the way down until it's tight with the case. With that caseback gasket in place, I can look into screwing down the caseback. For this build, I'm using an exhibition style caseback, otherwise known as an open caseback. I believe that this is the first exhibition style caseback featured on the channel when paired with a maxi style case. Here I'll give the case a quick shake just to make sure that the rotor has enough space to spin around freely. Obviously, with this being an automatic watch, that rose gold rotor in the back of the movement isn't just for looks, it's fully functional, helping to top off the mainspring of the watch. And with that case back now on, we're approaching the final stretch of the build. One last thing I have to do with the case back is break out the case back tightening tool and give it a few wrenches on this just to make sure that it's nice and tight to the case and ensure maximum water resistance. With that case back nice and tight, I'll pick up the watch and give it a quick once over before moving on to the next step. One thing I'd like to mention is a lot of this footage is pre me realizing that the NH38 balance wheel that I've swapped into this NH35 is not compatible. In the end, I did end up switching it back to an NH35 balance wheel just so that the watch would run properly. If you're asking yourself, what is he talking about? I discussed this in more detail in the first video of this series. With that aside, it's time to look at getting the bezel insert inserted into the bezel. So this protective film is removed, exposing the adhesive below. And now it's time to really concentrate, getting everything lined up and rotating the bezel a few times to make sure I'm not in between any of the clicks. Then I'll break out the bezel insert that I spent more time than I care to admit, painting and cleaning and then repainting and re-cleaning. Also that a few dashes and numbers on the bezel insert match the color of the hands and the hour markers. It was a lot of work, but I think it was worth it in the end. I've mentioned this before, but once these bezel inserts are pressed into place, there really is no getting them off without the use of chemicals to dissolve the glue underneath. That's why you'll see me here test fitting it just to make sure that I have everything lined up perfectly straight before pressing it down. Then once I'm happy with the alignment, I'll go ahead and press it down into place using my fingers, making sure that the bezel insert is in contact with all of the adhesive below. It's always a good idea to give it a few rotations just to make sure that the functions are still operating properly. And in this case, everything is working as it should, and with that, the case is now complete. And now I can move on to the final step, attaching the bracelet to the case. Just want to take a moment and thank all of those out there watching these videos and supporting the channel. A big thank you to all of those who trusted me with their builds and commissioned a piece through me. And another big thank you to my buddy Kyle and my neighbor for all their help with the new cameras and setup. This will most likely be the final video of the year, and man, what a year it was. So many builds happened this year that have yet to be featured on the channel, but I'll be sure to get those up as soon as I can in the new year. These builds allowed me to learn new techniques and try new things, as well as meet new people. All of this has allowed me to grow and expand, and in the future I hope to offer more personalization in these watches. Besides some new builds, there's a few new things coming to the channel, as well as the watch building business, so stay tuned for those in the new year. And of course, I wouldn't be able to do any of this without you guys following along and supporting the channel. If anybody is interested in commissioning a piece, please reach out to me at goldenstatewatchshop@gmail.com or on my Instagram at goldenstatewatchshop, and I'd be more than happy to talk to you about the build. And with that, all that's left to do in this build is to screw the last screw into place, and we're done. Here she is, our NH35 Submariner, inspired by the Artisans de Geneve rough mat. I have some mixed feelings about this build. Overall, I'm happy with the way it turned out, and I'm very pleased with the new sandblasted finish, as well as the use of the rose gold rotor and decorated bridge, along with the painted hands and hour markers. However, not being able to use the gold balance wheel in the back of the movement and the mixing ratios of the loom being incorrect does mean that this watch is not perfect. Though the watch didn't come out perfect, I'll take it as a learning experience and grow from it. As I mentioned before, this is the final video in the series, and it seems only fitting to finally see the watch in some natural sunlight. Thanks for watching.